Okay, so, well, welcome everyone. I'm excited to see so many participants. Most of you I don't know, but I'm Susan Post from BookWoman, and up in the left-hand strip is Becky Garcia, formerly of Malvern Books, and Becky is helping BookWoman, and I'm so appreciative. And really, BookWoman can't get by without a little help from our friends. So I am so happy to have Becky here to help us. So please join us, me and Becky, in welcoming Monica Macansantos, author of a new story collection, Love and Other Rituals, Selected Stories. And Monica will be joined in conversation with the best-selling and award-winning author, Elizabeth McCracken. And in case you haven't heard, please put your questions in the chat, and as time allows, we'll answer some or all of the questions that you have for Monica, and that will happen after the conversation. Monica Macansantos is the former James A. Michener Fellow at the University of Texas at Austin, where she earned her MFA in writing and also holds a PhD in creative writing from the Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in Colorado Review, Bennington Review, the Hopkins Review, Literary Hub, and Electric Literature, among other places. And she has been named notable in the Best American Essays 2016 and again in 2022. She has received fellowships from Hedgebrook, the iPark Foundation, Story Knife, Writers Retreat, the Kimmel Hardy Nelson Center for the Arts, and the Honor Society of Phi Kappa Phi. Love and Rituals is a story collection, as you might imagine, about Filipinos at home and in the diaspora. This is her first book. It's out from the University of Melbourne's Grattan Street Press. And joining her is Elizabeth McCracken, a good friend of BookWoman's and mine. Elizabeth is the author of 7 books, including The Souvenir Museum, Bowl Away, Thunderstruck, and Other Stories, winner of the 2014 Story Prize, and longlisted for the National Book Award, and The Giant's House, a National Book Award finalist. Her stories have appeared in Best American Short Fiction, won 3 Pushcart Prizes and a National Magazine Award, and the O. Henry Prize. Her latest book is the hero of this book. She has served on the faculty at the Iowa Writers Workshop and currently holds the James A. Michener Chair for Fiction at the University of Texas at Austin. And I don't think I even listed all of your books, Elizabeth. So welcome. Excited to hear Monica read, and I think we'll have a nice spicy conversation.
Thanks, Susan.
Monica, are you ready to read?
Yeah, I am. And thank you, Susan, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to Becky and to BookWoman for having me and for hosting this talk. So I'll be reading from the final story in the collection, Leaving Auckland. Leaving Auckland. Maya was fast asleep in her loft when Paolo rose from his airbed, his thin travel blanket falling away from his knees. The wind had pulled him from the depths of sleep. It was the kind of wind that sounded like a wailing child when it made its way into his dreams. Now that the brief warmth of summer had given way to the chill of autumn, this howl had become an insidious coming and going in his ears, reminding him that he wasn't used to this sound, that he was far away from home. Although Maya's twin bed could fit them both, Maya struggled to sleep beside him. So they ended up buying an airbed for him early on in their relationship. Before going to sleep, they'd lie parallel to each other in separate beds, him asking her about the dreams she had, her asking him if he was warm enough. Secure in his love, she fell asleep before he did, leaving him to ponder over the love he offered her. It was when she was asleep that his loneliness crept in, driving a wedge between them and the dark. In the morning, after every second night he spent with her, he'd fly back to Auckland, leaving her alone in the solitude of her Wellington apartment with a promise of his return. He approached the window and put a finger between the Venetian blinds, peering into the darkness at a city that slept. The Victorian houses that rose from the flanks of Mount Victoria glowed in the night, asserting their Englishness in the middle of the South Pacific. New Zealand was a blank slate to the builders of the city, a land one could fashion whichever way one wanted. And to Paulo, these houses spoke of an earlier time, a time from which he and Maya were far removed. After he and Maya had made love in her loft for the first time, he descended her stairs, looking out her window and into the deepening summer night before exclaiming, "This is paradise." From her loft, Maya laughed. She was a writer, unimpressed by cliches. She was used to this view and its foreignness in the same way that she had become used to other views in other foreign cities far away from the land of their birth. Paolo hadn't even left his adopted land to visit her, and yet these quaint Victorian homes, so different from his parents' squat bungalow in Auckland, taunted him with their permanence, with the stories they possessed but didn't tell. Tonight he felt as though he floated above these pitched rooftops, sailing above the wind that crashed into windows and howled through cracks that had been left unrepaired. As much as he tried to feel the ground beneath him as he walked these city streets, he felt as though he were invisible even to this town's ghosts. In Maya's case, she had chosen to live on the fourth floor of a modern apartment complex, buying herself a nice view of the hills and houses. A view was all she needed, for she didn't intend to settle here for good. Paolo wondered how a person could ever feel at home in a place that one had no desire to claim as one's home. He guessed it was Maya's rootlessness that allowed her to live in a city where he felt adrift. He looked up at Maya, asleep in her loft, the grills of its banister fashioned like a net that cradled her from harm. She had lived alone in too many places for too long. She was used to the solitude more than he was. Thank you.
Thanks, Monica. That was so beautiful.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's
Coming from you, that's a huge honor.
it's a beautiful story and just a beautiful collection. And I feel like I've been waiting for this moment since I first read your work, which was
Thank you.
in probably January of 2010. You were part of the first group of Michener Fellows that I read admissions for.
Oh yeah.
I'm feeling very sentimental.
Oh,
And as I say, the whole book, here's my copy, is just gorgeous. And thinking about the end of that story and a lot of moments in the book, and there's a line from another story in The Autumn Sun when one character says to another, and the dialogue, all of your dialogue is fantastic,
thank you.
but he says, "You must miss your childhood." And every time I've read that line, I'm so struck by it because it's such a knowing and interesting thing to say. And you write really wonderfully about childhood, both the kinds of childhoods people might miss and the kinds of childhoods they might not miss. And there are children throughout the book, both stories that are from their point of view, but also significant children. And I wonder if you can talk just a little bit about writing about both children, but also about childhood as a sort of place.
That's yeah, that's such a beautiful question, Elizabeth. Thank you for that. Um, I wonder if, as a writer, I've always remained a child. And I think that as writers, we all retain that part of ourselves that's somewhat guileless and innocent and wondering about the ways of the world and why people behave in certain ways. And I think that we should, it's a healthy perspective to maintain. And I wrote a lot of the stories set in childhood or from the perspectives of children when I was at the Michener Center. And I was in my early 20s, and I mean, maybe a lot of people get over their childhood by that point, but my memories of childhood were very vivid. And I grew up with a father who was a poet and also someone who whom a lot of people described as childlike, not necessarily childish. He was mature, and I think that his being childlike allowed him to be mature. Like I know that sounds like a contradiction, but if you're like so willing to become an adult, quote unquote, by transitioning to the ways of the world, its norms, and like not without really questioning why we have these norms and why we do certain things that can be cruel, or unjust. I think that's, well, that's not really maturity. That's just conformity. And I think that like writers and artists must maintain that. If that makes any sense. If that, like, I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Oh, you did beautifully. I know, I love that idea. I was talking not long ago to, I'm going to name drop, to my friend, the writer Yi-Yun Lee, who said of a mutual friend of ours, who's also a writer, that there's a phrase in Chinese meaning he has not lost his first heart, which is sort of that idea that to have the heart of your childhood, which doesn't mean that you're childish, but it means that that there's some wonder and interest and curiosity.
Yeah, I actually met this like years after because I spent a part of my childhood in Delaware, and there was this woman who knew my parents and me, and then years later I met her, and then she had read some of my stories, and she said, "Stop writing about children." And then I was like, "Why?" Why is there any reason for that? And then she thought that she was worried. She said that she was worried about me, that I wasn't growing up because I kept writing from the perspective of children. And it didn't sound right to me. Yeah.
I'm glad you didn't follow the advice.
Yeah, thank you.
Not intelligent advice. One of my questions is about knowing that your father was a poet. And if you can, do you think it made it easier to write, more difficult to write, to grow up the child of a writer?
I think on the whole, it made it easier because I've been talking to other writers, especially other writers of color and Filipino writers who didn't grow up in literary households or with parents who knew artists or knew what art making was. And because of that, like their parents and the people around them just didn't get what they were doing. And as young artists, they felt that they were the only person doing this, and this isn't really a thing. This is just a hobby. And because my dad, I saw my dad writing all the time, especially in the early morning. That's when he wrote. It felt like a thing. And we had books everywhere, and then my dad had writer friends, and it felt that it's something that you could do. It wasn't, and it's something that other people did. It wasn't just this thing that J.K. Rowling or some faraway author in America or England did. It like, and that Filipino authors, there was such a thing as Filipino writing, and a lot of Filipinos aren't aware that Filipinos can be writers or that there's such a thing as Filipino literature, which is like sad. So on the whole, it did help, but yeah, I think there were challenges in having a writer father and also a writer mother who, like, my mother wasn't as active as a writer, although she put out her first book 2 years ago
Oh,
in
wow.
her 60s. Yeah, so there's still expectations, and people will at some point start comparing you to your dad or your mom, especially when you start publishing, and you kind of learn to tune it out, especially if your parents are emotionally mature enough to believe that you're not in competition with your child and vice versa. It's just, yeah, because writing is not a competition in the end. It's more like a dialogue and a conversation. And it's like I feel like, well, Greg is here, and then we were talking about how when you're writing a book, you're kind of like inviting someone to a dinner conversation, and you're not just talking to that person, but in a sense you're inviting that person to respond to you. And I think because my dad was mature enough to feel the same way, yeah, like I got over it, like whatever expectations there were.
Yeah. But by Greg, Monica means Greg Marshall, author of the forthcoming Leg, out in June, who's also a classmate from the Michener Center with Monica. And so I promise not to talk endlessly about the Michener Center. This is my only Michener Center focused question. But I wonder, having talked about your parents, how daunting or not did it feel coming to Texas for 3 years to study writing?
Well, yeah, you talked about expectations, and it was probably one of the reasons why I decided to apply to MFA programs, because here in the Philippines, I was always seen as that kid who was attached to her dad all the time while he went to conferences and workshops. And they always saw me as the daughter of this and that. And yeah, and when you mention expectations, like there was that, and at some point I was kind of tired of it, so I just this thought of going to a place where nobody knew who I was. And I think that if nobody knows who you are, that pushes you to grow as an artist and as a human being, because you get to meet all these wonderful, interesting, intelligent people, which I had the fortune of doing at Michener.
Yeah. And do you, I'm trying to think of how to ask this question, which does not sound like I'm putting on the spot. How was the experience of getting your MFA?
Well,
And you can be honest. I'm not saying, was it wonderful? Tell me it was wonderful.
And I think that as an international student, there were some unique challenges that American students wouldn't have otherwise faced. Although I'm sure it was challenging and difficult for everyone, but just, for instance, finding an apartment and learning how to deal with my landlord, those were things that I needed to learn, and how to like deal with my classmates and not be rude when giving feedback, and how to accept feedback that may have been painful to me personally, but would have also allowed me to grow. I think that, yeah, on the whole, it was great. Yeah, I think that attending an MFA program as an international student and as a person of color in 2010 is probably vastly different from the way it is now, because we're having deeper and more open conversations about race in workshops, and I'm so glad that that's happening.
Yeah, I think that's true. One of the reasons I asked about coming to Texas is that travel is one of the great themes of this
Mhm.
collection, and sort of geography in general. It's a story collection in which you really sort of feel the curve of the earth, being at home and being elsewhere. And there's a lovely story, Stopover, that's about somebody who comes to Austin to visit her friend who's in graduate school. So my next question is about setting, because you're brilliant at it, and I want to know both about geography, which repeats in the book, but also just about place. And I'm thinking particularly in the first story, The Feast of All Souls, which is in a very particular cemetery, which you describe so that it's palpable, that we can sort of feel the ground shifting underneath us as we read it. So can you talk a little bit how you think about setting, and when you know when you're writing a story about where it's going to be set, both in the large sense and in the small sense?
Yeah, I'm grateful that you asked me that question, because I think that if I didn't become an English major, I would have majored in geography, maybe, because I've always loved looking at maps, and maybe my dad had a part in that, because he would buy a globe for me, and then he would buy maps, and then he'd tell me about this country, and this is how they dress, and this is their culture, and it was always just really fascinating to me. And yeah, I know that I'm going on a tangent here, and pardon me if I do, but
Please.
yeah. Oh, and so I took this European studies course in college, and then I was the only person who got a perfect score, because I got to name all the European countries, like, right, even Moldova, and nobody knew where Moldova was, but I knew where it was. So anyway, yeah, back to setting. So I was born in the Philippines, and I spent 5 years of my childhood in Delaware, and then we returned to the Philippines. And because we sort of moved around a lot, compared at least to other families, I just took a very strong interest in setting, because I guess that when you move a lot, you see how setting shapes people and their attitudes. And like, even when you go to a certain place, like, setting informs, and like geography informs your experiences and the way you see the world and yourself in ways that you're often not aware of. So like, I remember my first year of Austin, just figuring out how to get to the nearest Target and looking at all the bus routes, and it was like, other people would find it daunting, but I found it interesting. And then I remember getting on the wrong bus on the way home, and then like just being on the wrong bus for an entire hour, and like wondering where where I was. And so yeah, and um it's always like fun for me as a writer, like sitting at my desk in a room that's far away from a place that I'm writing about, just to figure out how my characters are, well, interacting with their settings. And like, it's a way to ground myself as an author. Like, if I'm writing about New Zealand, for instance, even if I'm not living in New Zealand anymore, like, I have to ground myself in that place again. And a lot of that involves describing the setting and depicting how that setting shapes a character's life. So yeah.
Yeah, I love that. 'Cause only now does it occur to me that there's so much in the book about the places that are easy to get to and the places that are difficult to get to. And it's, of course, in Stopover, the point of view character, Kathy, is a flight attendant, and it's incredibly easy for her to get to Austin. But once she gets to Austin to visit her friend who doesn't own a car, and Kathy decides not to rent a car, it's just impossible to get anywhere.
And it's like what it was one of the annoying things about Austin, which I didn't realize was, or I didn't like consciously realize, like in Stopover, I felt that the bus, like when I was writing that in my Austin apartment, I was like, the Austin train system is, the Austin bus system is great. And then when I came back in 2019, after 3 years of living in New Zealand, I was like, this is awful. I have to like call an Uber all the time and great for Uber, but yeah, I tried like depending on the bus system for a day, and then I was like, so this is why I didn't exactly have a life in Austin, because I didn't have a car. Like I didn't like, but then the things I got to do so easily in Wellington, for instance, like go to Tango Milongas, like it's so hard to figure out here. So like this is why I was in my apartment all the time.
Well, it feels, I mean, again, in the book as well, it feels like a fundamental truth that everything depends on how easy it is to get places. It's in inheritances too. This moment that I'm looking, that the main character gets a call. He's in Manila and he gets a call from his family in Baguio, and the first thing he has to think about is how difficult it will be to get home, and of his sister who might be closer. And it shapes your life, whether it's easy to get to home or get to friends.
Yeah, it's interesting that you thought about that, because in the Philippines, like somehow it's harder to travel within the Philippines than for like a Filipino to travel to another country, which it's like I like for some reason I visit the States more often than I visit certain parts of the Philippines. And sometimes like that has to do with class a lot. Like I was also thinking about Maricel, another story in the collection, and how one girl's experience of Baguio is very different from her friend's experience of Baguio, because like she's less privileged and she goes to places in Baguio that her other friend is like not aware of at all, because her other friend is just wealthier and like doesn't like I also reminds me of like the way Americans talked about place when I was there. It's like, oh, that's a bad neighborhood, and then like why is it bad? and then you realize that well, it's either low income or black and brown people live there, and like just people won't mention it, but it's just a bad neighborhood.
Well, there's a lot in the collection about income disparity, and I wonder what draws you to write about it.
I think that like because the Philippines is such a socially stratified place, and it's a heavily classicist culture, it makes me write about it even more, because like I also had friends from different socioeconomic classes, and it was just fascinating for me to observe how our brand preferences were different, and how for like one friend it's okay to be friends with someone or date someone who's like, for me, sketch. So and it just
Sorry,
like defines, it's like it just defines attitude so strongly. And it's also interesting to see that when you like go to other countries as a Filipino, because people have different attitudes towards class, and once you're a person of color or a foreign person in another country, like your foreignness and your like the shade of your skin also designates you into a certain class. And to be like in the Christian Catholic majority in the Philippines, and suddenly to be like a Filipino, and to be identified as that Filipino in Austin was just interesting to me. So like yeah. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but
No, you are. And one of the, I mean, I feel like there are a lot of things that you write about just sort of with ease, and they're not the topic of the story, but they're important to the world of the story. Like those questions about who has money and who doesn't, and who has power and who doesn't. And
yeah,
how that's
because
also dependent on location.
yeah, and like in the end, well, because people have told me, you get to travel a lot, and it makes me aware of how that has shaped my personality, and how that has like, well, it can broaden your perspective, but at the same time, it can also blind you to, well, the limits of your perspective. So for instance, Kathy in Stopover gets to travel all the time, and she's like, America supposedly expands her worldview, but I think that it gives her a false sense of the privileges she really has, because, well, she's like an airline worker, and she's the bag girl, and she's not that privileged, and like she gets to see places, but is she able to like interact with certain people outside her class? Like, is she able to like get a scholarship to go to grad school and expand her worldview? Like, in many ways, like she's still limited by class, even if she's able to like travel everywhere.
Yeah, I love that story because, and I hope you don't mind me characterizing it this way, it's a story from the point of view of somebody who is a total pain in the neck. She's a complainer, and and it's a really interesting perspective, because she's visiting an old friend, and the story is about sort of the uneasiness of that friendship, but she comes through as this multi-dimensional difficult character.
Yeah, and what I like about writing fiction is that I get to inhabit the shoes of people whom I may not necessarily like. So Stopover was based on a very difficult weekend with a difficult friend who came to visit me, and I told the story at first from my perspective, but it wasn't working. And I think that what makes fiction work is our efforts as fiction writers to understand the other side and where other people are coming from. You're not just trying to understand yourself, but you're trying to like figure out why this person felt this way towards you or towards other people. And yeah.
Well, so following on that, one of the questions I have for you is about the stories that are from the point of view of characters who are not like you. You write quite a few stories from the point of view of men, and this isn't a leading question anyway. I would just love to hear you talk about doing that, and whether it seems like a big deal or not a big deal to you. The question of writing in general across any difference between you and your characters.
I think that it's a big deal for me, but then this isn't idiomatic, but it's a necessary deal, or it's like something that's necessary for me as a fiction writer to do, because I don't know, maybe I'm wrong here, but if I'm not struggling as a writer, like if things are easy, then things also get boring in my fiction, and I want to make things interesting, and I just like want to flex my muscles as a writer by sometimes writing from the perspective of men. And like writing for me is always an exercise in understanding things that I don't get, because if I get it already, then why should I even write about it? Like I'd rather just cook or whatever. But anyway, but yeah, because yeah, it's nice that you mentioned men, because like I've had like awful experiences sometimes with the men in my life, and not just awful, sometimes oftentimes great, but I've always been interested in why men can be so complicated, and despite sometimes wanting to be a good person runs counter to our ideas of masculinity and being a man. And like sometimes like masculinity can aid in being in these people becoming better people by being better men. But yeah, it's all complicated. I think that men sometimes have a harder time than women in figuring things out because they run against all these expectations. I could be wrong, but yeah.
Yeah, interesting. I'll say that one thing that I will say, there are many ways in, I'm going to stop my explanation of it. One thing that has changed in workshop recently that I find really interesting is that people are less brave about writing about people who are not demographically exactly like them.
Yeah, and
Just for this moment, I think.
it's I think that it's a good thing to think about, like why, for instance, a white person would want to write from the perspective of a black person, and instead of like giving that seat to a black person. And I can see where that argument is coming from, because like sometimes like there'll be a white expat who wants to write this very exotified portrayal of Filipinos and the Philippines, and because this person has much more privilege, they're the ones who get book deals. So I think it's great to think about, but at the same time, I think that, well, going back to fiction writing, like what's the beauty of it is that it allows you to understand people who are not like you better. And I think that what helps me is that I stay within like my lane, which is like the Filipino lane. I just like write about Filipinos, and I've written a story from the point of view of a white person that hasn't yet been published, but yeah, I think that like at some point, if the more perspectives we let into the conversation, the more nuanced these conversations become. And it's like it's something that's hard to swallow, but we just really have to stop canceling people when they speak opposing views. So yeah.
I have a question from, I have two questions, one from Susan and one from Greg, and would like to encourage people to put their questions into the chat. From Susan, Monica, why did you pick the story you read?
Why? I think that like, well, I remember Carolyn Forche at Story Knife in Alaska telling us last year that when you pick something to read, pick something that astonishes people with the beauty of its prose. And I think this is a story where I grew stylistically. So I was just showing off my skills. But I wanted to read Stopover too. I was just like struggling last night here in the Philippines, but I could have read Stopover too because it's set in Austin, and I also like the prose of that story. But yeah.
Do you read the same things all the time, or do you like to mix it up for readings?
I like mixing it up with this particular passage because like it's had some impact on people. Like I decided to read that passage, but yeah, I like mixing it up. But like this is like a particularly favorite passage because like I just like the poetry of it.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, and like how, yeah, like you were talking about geography and setting, and people keep talking about the Wellington wind because it's like it's stronger than the Chicago wind. Like it's just gale force wind, and it'll wake you up in the middle of the night. And at some point it had to make its way into my story, so that's why it's there. Yeah.
That might partially answer Greg's question, which is talk about writing about New Zealand and how that shaped you as a writer.
Yeah, that's like,
Besides
thank
the
you.
Wellington
Thank you,
wind.
Greg, for yeah, for that question. I went to New Zealand to do a PhD in creative writing because I wanted to write a novel about the Marcos dictatorship. And I wrote that novel and I'm still working on it. I'm still revising it. But what I did not expect was for me to write about New Zealand and about Filipinos living in New Zealand, because there's like nothing about Filipinos in New Zealand at this time. Like there are some poets, and like I recently heard about a Filipino playwright who produced a play about Filipinos in New Zealand, but otherwise it's not as like well developed as Filipino writing in America. And it just, because you're writing into a vacuum, there's no like real established tradition of Filipino New Zealand writing. Like you have more freedom to play around, and of course you have to be careful with, I don't know, like, because like they just have a very different racial politics down there with like Maori and Pacifica peoples. You have to be careful still, but I think it's a good exercise in writing within like a non-tradition, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, no, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Susan would like to know how long Stopover is.
Stopover is about 7,200 words, if I'm correct. Yeah, it's long.
Do you have a
My
do you have
stories
a
are long.
story, a general story length? I never notice. Whenever I read stories, I think, oh, that story was the length it was supposed to be. And I have a sense that Leaving Auckland is longer than the others.
Yeah. Leaving Auckland and Inheritances and Playing with Dolls are the long short stories. Leaving Auckland might be the longest.
From Greg, I'd also love to hear about when you know something is a short story versus when it's a novel. Do your short stories grow into novels, or do they start out as different beasts?
I think my short stories in general remain short stories because I'm always fascinated by like that moment in time that's more interesting in a person's life than other moments in their lives, and like how that moment speaks for their entire lives. The novels I've written were just like didn't start out as short stories. I already felt that they were novels. So right now I'm working on another novel about two childhood friends. Like one of them's Filipino and one of them is biracial Filipino. She's half white. And I don't know, like it's interesting that Greg asked me that, because I wondered at first if it was going to be a short story, and then I thought that like, oh, this isn't going to work as a story, and then I realized that I felt that way because I was seeing it as a short story. And so when I started writing it as a novel, that's when things started expanding and working, and I could like really see it as a novel. But would some of my, like Playing with Dolls is probably, it's about like this wealthy family in Baguio, and then there's a ton of characters. That could possibly be a novel, but it's just that I don't like rich people in general, so I'm not sure if I could spend years with these characters. It's like it's all about like whether or not I want to spend like prolonged periods of time with certain characters.
Yeah.
Or if I feel the impetus to.
Yeah, that makes sense. From Ihioma, who I assume is the Ihioma that we know.
Huma. He
Um,
is.
oh, good. Hello. Often international writers are accused of writing for an international audience instead of a local one. Who do you think you write for? I think I'm fascinated by the
Yeah.
question of how you, or any writer, but specifically you, consider audience.
Yeah, so like I'm glad Huma asked that question, because there oftentimes I can sense when a Filipino, particularly a Filipino from the diaspora, is writing for an international audience, because they'll be exoticizing a lot and then like bringing up our mythical monsters like the aswang and the manananggal, and then they'll be using Tagalog words in ways that we don't. And it's it's always weird when that happens, and then Imelda Marcos will come up, and then there'll be like this wildly wealthy family, and when they follow all the cliches, and when they're like pandering to a Western and white gaze, that's when I feel that they're selling out, and unfortunately. But I I try to avoid that, even if I feel that I do write for an international audience, but I still keep Filipinos primarily in mind, because in the end, like if I'm not true to my culture, if I'm like performing my culture for a Western audience, like being that token Filipino, then I won't be authentic to myself. And yeah, it's still like, yeah, a tightrope that you're walking, that I still like, still don't want to limit my audience to Filipinos alone. But if it makes any sense, like they are my core audience. And I think that because like I don't like portraying Filipinos as this magical people with like all these mythical monsters. Like it's taken me or it's been more difficult for me in general to sell my work and to get my work published, because I don't perform my culture. But I think that it's the more honorable path. I think Ihioma would like get to this. Yeah.
Do you ever feel a pressure to explain things that you um that you don't want to explain? I was interested actually by the fact that you've got a glossary in the back of your book.
Yeah, if I do have a chance to like reissue this book, that won't be there.
I was wondering about that choice. It was interesting. I actually didn't. It feels, yeah. It didn't. I will say it's my only objection to the book is that it didn't feel necessary to me.
Yeah, but then like the Australians who published this were like, oh, this is necessary. But I just feel that, and this is like
Australians.
well, I guess this speaks to the question of addressing an international audience, that sometimes it can make you a better writer, because it, like, if you're going to explain something like something that Americans have never seen before, like a jeepney, which is like our bus but different. Um, if I were just writing for Filipinos, I just say, oh, he stepped into a jeepney. But if I were writing for like non-Filipinos, because like in the end, you want to write for the human, for humanity, right? So like you could describe how it feels to be sitting in the jeepney, and how like cramped it is, and how low the ceiling is, stuff like that, just to make people feel what a jeepney is without having to like, without sounding like a Wikipedia article. Like, this is what the jeepney is. We take this to work or to school. No, this is the thing. And like I learned that at Michener, because yeah, I was talking to Greg in an interview about how, like, at my first workshop with Oscar Casares, I include, because I thought that, oh, these Americans won't understand where I'm coming from, which was like one of the challenges of just being there as an international student. Like I have to put footnotes in my stories, and people are like, you don't need this, because you yeah, just do it organically. And yeah, it's like, it was part of my growth as a writer.
So I've slowly learned not to ask people what they're working on because in interviews, because so often people go. I recently interviewed somebody with, good reason. I asked her that question, and her answer was, "Oh, I forgot to tell you not to ask me that question." So I'm going to ask you a different question, which is, what in your writing career, looking forward to, would you like to write? Do you have ambitions for, a giant novel or children's books or, essays, a travel book?
They're like, I have all these ideas swirling in my mind. Like there's this short story that I never get to write about like the Filipino DB Cooper, who hijacked a plane in the year 2000, and like basically he had a grenade in his hand, and like the steward had to push him out, and I was like, oh my God, why am I not writing about this yet? And I never get to write about it because like there are just too many projects in the pipeline. So yeah, I'm comfortable talking about the things I'm working on. So there's this novel that I've been working on. I had to set it aside for other projects, but it's set in Austin, and it's about two friends again, two different friends, and it explores race in the Philippines and white privilege, because like we have a lot of biracial beauty queens who are basically white passing, and then Filipinos embrace them, and then they think that, oh, if we could only be as white as you. And yeah, it's like one of those themes that I've been meaning to explore. And I would like to write about a former professor of mine who was very kind, but who had very different political inclinations from mine. He was like deeply dyed in the wool Marxist. Like he was a communist. And but then he was like so kind to me, even if I annoyed him with my questions about communism, like can that work? And like I just like want that kind of like political novel where it's just two human beings being like the human beings they are, instead of like this novel of grand ambitions where like people talk about their ideas. Like it's just people with being who they are and having the beliefs they are. I've always wanted to write plays, which is something I didn't get to do at Michener. I could have, like, if my secondary genre was playwriting, but I named poetry as my secondary genre. I would like to go back to poetry.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
I have to say, just as an elevator pitch, the Filipino DB Cooper,
Yeah.
meet him. I want to read
Oh,
all
yeah.
of that stuff, but just
Yeah,
that phrase is very exciting.
Yeah, I would, because like it was for a long time the steward was accused of being a murderer, and then he was like, come on, I had to. He was gonna blow up the plane. And then so yeah, like I probably shouldn't be sharing it here because somebody might steal the idea, but
You can trust us.
yeah, thank you.
Are there any other questions for Monica?
I think there was one from Susan.
Oh, let's see. Oh, sorry. Yes, sorry, Susan. Was there a community of authors in New Zealand?
Oh yeah, it's like there's an amazing community of writers there, and I still remain in touch with them. It's small, and I think that like smallness has its advantages and disadvantages. So you know each other well, but then you know the usual things, like there can be a lot of cliquishness and politics involved in small groups that that turns me off. But
Who do you think of as your community of writers these days, having lived in a bunch of different places?
I don't know. Maybe Greg. He's like me. And
You could do a lot worse.
And well, I have friends, writer friends in the Philippines. I have writer friends in the States and New Zealand. It's just that because I publish primarily in the States these days, it might be the States, the American literary community, that I'm more in touch with, for better or worse. I think for better.
Monica, it's about 8:30 here.
Yeah.
And about 9:30 in the morning there.
Yeah.
You're in the future for me.
Thank you. Yeah, I am. And you're in the
present
past.
for you.
Like,
I acknowledge that. It's been such a joy to talk to you.
yeah, likewise. And it's always an honor and a joy to talk to you, Elizabeth.
Yeah, it's really nice.
Yeah.
And here's Susan.
Thank you, Susan.
Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Elizabeth. Monica, what is one thing you'd want us to take away from your collection? Kind of,
That
what's my best way to sell your book at BookWoman?
So my publisher, what does the blurb here is, a powerful new voice bringing us the raw and darkly beautiful perspectives of characters lost both in and out of their homeland, the Philippines. Well, that's a good way of describing it, but I think we often don't realize how similar we all are. Like, we all think that we're different, and in many ways we are, but then in many ways we're all the same. And my story collection, more than being a book about the Philippines, is about people with their complicated relationships and how difficult and complicated it is to love, but how we still keep loving. I don't know. I'm not great at selling my own stuff.
Well, that was nice. I was just looking for something more intimate, and so the love angle is very intimate. Thank
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Susan. And thank you to everyone who came. And yeah, hi, Erica. And hi, everyone who, like, yeah, thought it was like this was an hour worth spending with me and Elizabeth.
It was lovely. Thank you so much.
Yes,
Thank you,
it
Susan
was,
and
and
Becky.
thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you again, Becky, and for everyone that joined us. Thank you so much.